Good evening and welcome everyone to the 15th annual Ron McCallum debate on industrial relations. I'm James Fleming, the Executive Director of the Australian Institute of Employment Rights, the AIER, and this is the 20th anniversary of the Institute. To mark the occasion, we've made a short film with some of the highlights of our previous debates over the years, going back all the way to 2006 and our first debate about work choices. So it was actually the work choices changes and their radical reduction of work entitlements and the safety net that inspired the creation of the Institute. Many saw the work choices changes as greatly unfair, removing unfair dismissal rights for many people and diminishing the safety net of awards. So the idea of the Institute was to restore fairness and tripartism in the system and to bring unions, employers and experts together to re-establish some acceptable fundamental rights and norms that we might, well, if not all agree on, that there'd be some broad consensus on. This then led to the creation of a Charter of Employment Rights, and that informs the work that we continue to do today. You'll see in the film that the first debate was actually quite heated, and many of the issues raised in the debates over the years are still very much live questions and relevant to today's topic. So tonight's debate topic is now or never. How can we make workplace relations fairer and more productive? Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome our live audience at the Wesley Conference Centre in Sydney and also those tuning in online. We've put some of our ideas for how workplace relations can be made more fair and productive in our latest book, A New Work Relations Architecture. And we're giving you all a copy for those in attendance in person. And all the registrants, we're going to send a digital copy by email afterwards. So a big thanks to our esteemed debate participants and keynote speakers, and to our main sponsors tonight, Harmer's Workplace Lawyers, for their generous contribution, which helps make this debate possible. The format of the debate is that we'll show the short film. Then we'll hear from our three distinguished keynote speakers, the first being our guest of honour and patron, Emeritus Professor Ron McCallum. Then we'll hear from Justice Mordy Bromberg, the President of the Australian Law Reform Commission. And finally, from our keynote speakers, we'll hear from Minister Amanda Wishworth, who I believe is just coming from the airport and 5 minutes away. Our moderator, Justice Hatcher, the President of the Fair Work Commission, will then host the debate, and I'll turn things over to him. And please note the proceedings are being recorded and will be uploaded online afterwards. So now I'd like to go ahead and play the film with highlights from our previous debates.
This government has decided that there should be a return to the freedom of contract days of the 1890s. Now, this is a massive change. It is indeed a revolution.
Our publishing business currently has less than 100 employees, that magical number. And yet I'm not interested in taking advantage of the opportunities now afforded to me. And I think that I'm not alone, that most employers want to treat their staff in a fair and accountable manner. I support the Institute because I think it's important that we open up the debate on the future of workplace relations in Australia. And I believe that the tripartite framework of the Institute is the best way to create rights that will have broad community support.
Joe Hockey, if I could start with you. Obviously, we can't avoid the elephant in the room.
Wages have gone up in real terms since the 27th of March, and industrial disputation at its lowest level since 1913.
But it is true that some workers have had to give up some of the benefits that they previously enjoyed to take part in your, what you would say is nirvana here.
But Jana, what you don't hear is the trade-off, the benefits that they're getting.
How has work choices legislation impacted on your members' relationship with Sharon's members?
We have dramatically reduced levels of industrial disputation, but it's a very harmonious environment, and that's to the advantage of employees and employers.
Right, a harmonious environment. Sharon.
This is fantasy land.
They want to compete on the two fundamental principles of international law set in the Philadelphia Declaration, enshrined in the Constitution of the ILO, that labour is not a commodity. It is not a commodity.
We all want to feel valued. When we feel valued, then we are invested and we're prepared to invest more discretionary effort. We're more productive, we're more creative.
We had one of the most poorly trained supervisory and managerial workforces in the world. I'm not sure whether that's changed.
We have a distinguished American guest with us.
I sort of think of the Me Too movement as like the clock striking 13, in that you would think if there were effective voice, complaint, and conflict resolution procedures in organizations, we wouldn't have such reprehensible behaviour.
I worry that inequality is going to be driven even further apart. I do think our labour law system, as it's evolved, allowing such a widespread use of casual work and independent contracting has contributed to that.
When you think about the insecure work rates across the economy, when you think about how few employees are covered by collective agreements today, there is flexibility, but it's predominantly with employers.
When there's a loophole that undercuts job security or wages for a worker, Parliaments, particularly over the last 10 years, have tended to just let it slide.
This bill will only make it more difficult for employers to employ casuals.
The best way to future-proof our workplace relations system is to ensure that the system is as flexible as possible while preserving fairness for all.
I could almost get everyone to sign up to, we need a system that's flexible and fair. It's then how you move beyond that point.
We really have a lot of work to do, and we need to think outside the square in a world where technology is changing.
We can't rely on set and forget approaches to policy, thanks to that rapid pace of change.
I hope it was a reasonably balanced debate, Joe. We tried to make it that way. I'm sorry if it didn't come out that way in the wash, but no doubt it'll resume at another venue another time. Thank you very much.
Let me now go ahead and introduce our patron and guest of honour tonight, Ron McCallum, after whom the debate is named. So Ron has been the AIER's patron for many years and is one of Australia's most well-regarded law experts and one of the world's leading disability advocates. He is a past chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ron is also the first totally blind person to have been appointed to a full professorship in any field at any university in Australia or New Zealand. He's a former professor and Dean of Law at Sydney University, and he was Senior Australian of the Year in 2011. Over to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, James. I am truly honoured to be here at the 20th anniversary, 20 years of the Ron McCallum debate. It still gives me shivers to say that, and I must acknowledge the wonderful work throughout those 2 decades of Michael Harmer and all our colleagues. If you'll allow me, I want to acknowledge 2 people who are here this evening. First, I am truly honoured that Justice Morty Bromberg is here tonight. He was at the first debate. I have learned a great deal from him from when he was a student of mine, and now I learn much more now that he's been a federal court judge for years and years, and he's a dear friend. I also want to acknowledge Professor Therese McDermott from from Macquarie University. I'm mixing my states. When I came up to Sydney, to the University of Sydney 32 years ago, Therese and I taught labour law together, and I learned a great deal from her, so I'm pleased to see her still in the field. Well, our topic tonight is really how to make workplaces fairer and more productive. Fairness is a word in Australian labour law that we've been paying lip service to for years and years. We have what I'd call a surface approach to fairness. If I go back to 1971, in the New South Wales Industrial Commission, we had Lottie's case. Lottie's case was an interesting one because it was a paid official or organiser of the AWU, the Australian Workers' Union, and the AWU dismissed him, and he brought an unfair dismissal proceedings against the union. And it was Justice Sheldon who said, well, what you have to give the employee before you're dismissing her or him is a fair go all round. But it was all very surface, there was no great detail. Similarly, we've been in love with the word fairness in relation to statutes. The very first one I can find is the Fair Work Act 1994 of South Australia. and another bill that I had something to do with, the Fair Employment Bill 2000 in Victoria, which failed to pass. And of course, we have the Fair Work Act in 2009. But I think if we want to make workplaces fairer, we have to go deeper. And I've been looking at some statistics and figures. First of all, there's the Equality at Work Index of November this year. So it's just come out last week. And it's from the Australian Centre for Gender Equity and Inclusion at Work at the University of Sydney, Ray Cooper and her colleagues. And they show that while gender equity has increased for many women, in the area of safety and health and harassment, we're going backwards. That we're losing fairness for women in the workplace, particularly in the areas of safety. Another report is the Workplace Wellbeing Index 2005 by Gallagher Benefits and HR Consulting. And they show that in the areas of mental health and burnout, over the last 3 years, Australia has been going backwards. How do we get workplaces to be more fair and inclusive when we're going backwards? I think we need what I call not surface fairness, but we need deep listening by employers, employees and trades unions. We need to listen to employees. We need to make people welcome. We need to ensure inclusion. And I think we can do a lot better and take fairness into a deeper area where it has much more meaning for all employees. And we also need to make sure that everyone gets appropriate remuneration, and we need to look at childcare and all of the other things. It's something I think we can do. I think that we're facing huge numbers of challenges. We're seeing the workplace is fragmented, people working at home, people working in different locations, more and more people being employee-like rather than standard employees. And we're going to see automation and robotics. If we want to keep productivity with all these changes, we must ensure that everybody is looked after, that the fair go all round is individualised to mean that everyone is listened to, everyone is learned from, so that we can become a more productive, clearer and happier society. And let me say that I think the big area that's still greatly neglected is the whole area of mental health and burnout, particularly in public sector institutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron. And as is custom with the debates, we'll hear from Ron later in the debate with his reflections on how it went. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce Justice Morty Bromberg, who is the President of the Australian Law Reform Commission. He was appointed a judge at the Federal Court of Australia in 2009 after a long career as a barrister at the Victorian Bar and a solicitor working in Melbourne, London and Hong Kong. He was also an occasional consultant to the International Labour Organization. Justice Bromberg presided over many of the most important cases in the areas of law in which he practiced. His honour led the Federal Court's Employment and Industrial Relations National Practice Area, and his honour's wide-ranging practice and experience included administrative law, native title law, migration law, human rights and constitutional law. So some 14 years and over 500 judgments after his honour's appointment to the Federal Court, he was appointed President of the ALRC in July 2023 for a period of 5 years. But he also continues as a part-time judge at the Federal Court. Justice Bromberg has concluded a range of ALRC inquiries and is currently leading the review into justice responses to sexual violence and the Future Acts regime under the Native Title Act 1993. Welcome, Justice Bromberg.
Thank you, James, for that generous introduction. In my current position as President of the Australian Law Reform Commission, I get invited to speak at events like tonight's fairly often. As the founding president of the Australian Institute of Employment Rights, the wonderful institution that's hosting tonight, I was particularly pleased to receive this invitation to speak, especially as I was very firmly instructed to be brief. But what pleased me more was that the invitation was an invitation to speak at an event which honours my great friend and mentor, Ron McCallum. Ron McCallum and I go back a long way. Ron was my lecturer when I was but a 18-year-old student at university. Ron lectured me in labour law. Ron ignited my passion for labour law, a passion which has really dominated my work as a lawyer and my work as a judge. If I have any wisdom at all about labour law, it is largely due to Ron. Even the little bit of wisdom I wish to convey to you tonight, that there is a better way to reform our labour laws, has a connection to Ron. And some of it you've heard about already. Ron and I were both members of the steering committee of eminent persons which, as part of a law reform exercise engaged in by the Australian Institute of Employment Rights in 2006-2007, developed the Australian Charter of Employment Rights and this accompanying book by the same name. As the introduction to the book states, the Charter was created as an instrument for advocating for the reform of labour law in Australia. The message that I really want to convey tonight is not so much about how we should reform the substance of our labour laws. It is a message largely about process. However, I cannot pass over the Charter of Employment Rights without saying that that document was and remains a very, very useful guide to how the content of our labour laws should be reformed. The Charter is framed as a statement of the reciprocal rights of workers and employers that our laws should recognise and enforce. It was crafted on the premise that improved workplace relations requires a collaborative culture in which workers commit to the legitimate expectations of the enterprise in which they work, and employers provide for the legitimate expectations of their workers. The importance of collaboration, or of a collaborative approach, was not only an essential element central to the Charter's content, it was also the defining ingredient in the law reform process through which the Charter was created. The Charter is largely based on the rights recognised in conventions and recommendations made through the collaborative tripartite processes of the ILO, in which all of the three stakeholders in labour relations, workers, employers and government, have direct input into the formation of labour law reform at the international level. Indeed, the very idea for the formation of the Australian Institute of Employment Rights as a think tank for the promotion of labour law reform was that a tripartite structure fairly reflecting the perspectives of employers, workers and government should beat the heart of this institution as well as its proposals for reform. The impetus for that approach to labour law reform is reflected in Bob Hawke's foreword to the Charter of Employment Rights. Our esteemed former Prime Minister said this, and I quote, I can't quite do it in his accent, but my appeal to Australia, to all workers, to all employers, to all political parties is this: let Australia move beyond the class politics, the vitriol, the entrenched distrust and the short-sightedness that have characterised at least the last 10 years of industrial relations in this country. Let us set aside forever the senseless tug of war between labour and capital and encourage both to pull cooperatively in the one direction. Australian industrial relations has now reached the tipping point. Australia needs to recognise that a winner-take-all approach is unsustainable, but that a win-win solution is attainable. That impetus for a changed way of reforming labour law in Australia is also reflected in my own words in the introduction to the book, where I said this, and I can do this in my own accent. A balanced, fair and inclusive approach to workplace relations in Australia is long overdue. Labour law has been a political football kicked back and forth by the ideological warriors of class politics for far too long and at far too great a cost. Class-based politics have engendered an adversarial and conflict-driven approach to workplace relations that has not served Australia well. This trend continues. The Charter is an attempt to encourage a new direction. Now, unfortunately, the new collaborative tripartite direction to labour law reform that the Charter was based upon and which it tried to foster has not eventuated. Labour law reform in Australia remains a largely partisan exercise which, depending on which of our major political parties is in government, either the agenda of the workers or alternatively the agenda of the employers is the primary basis for the reform. A well-crafted and far more effective law reform process would be based on a contemporaneous, holistic consideration of the agendas of all relevant stakeholders. That consideration would be conducted with comprehensive consultation and the active participation of all relevant stakeholders. It would make a non-partisan, independent, evidence-based assessment of the merits of each and every claim for reform. The process would identify the legitimate rights and needs of workers and those of employers, and, supported by transparent reasoning, the law reform process will demonstrate how, in accordance with a principled rather than a value-laden approach, those rights and interests have been appropriately balanced to achieve a regime which is fair to all. Now, if Noting that the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations is in the room, you're beginning to think that my speech is a pitch for an Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry into Australia's labour laws. Let me assure you, you are correct. But let me end by saying that, based on my 45 years of experience of labour law, whoever is given the opportunity to conduct a labour law reform exercise of the kind that I am here advocating for, that exercise can be expected to unveil a very rich vein of productivity benefits, a goldmine of productivity, able to be accessed and shared by both workers and employers alike. That goldmine is what Bob Hawke had in mind as the win-win solution to the problematic winner-take-all approach to the reform of Australian labour laws. Thank you for listening, and given that I have been brief, can I take the opportunity to acknowledge some of the people who were here at the very beginning and without whose assistance this institute would never have lasted. I speak obviously of Ron McCallum, but I also speak of Michael Harmer and Fiona Hardy. I hope I haven't missed any of the originals, but their contribution to the work of the Australian Institute of Employment Rights has been nothing other than magnificent, and I'm pleased to be able to publicly say so. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Bromberg. I'd now like to introduce our final keynote speaker, the Honourable Amanda Rishworth, Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. If you'd like to please come to the stage, and I'll say a few words of introduction. So in 2007, Minister Rishworth was elected as the member for Kingston at 29 years of age. She's a member of the Federal Labor's Cabinet and was previously Minister for Social Services and Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. She previously served in a number of shadow ministries, including for early childhood education and development, and youth and veterans affairs and defence personnel. She was educated at state schools in Adelaide and was a volunteer swimming instructor and surf lifesaver. During her university studies, she worked as a sales assistant and developed a strong interest in workplace fairness. Amanda followed this passion to work in the trade union movement, both as a union rep and as an occupational health and safety trainer. Amanda graduated with a Bachelor of Psychology with honours from Flinders University and a Master's degree in Psychology from Adelaide University. And after graduating, she practiced as a psychologist, working with general practitioners in the delivery of mental health care to the community. I'm told she lives in Hallett Cove with her husband, Tim, and their two young sons, Percy and Oscar. Thanks, it's great to have you, Amanda, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I've come straight from the airport to from Canberra to here, so I apologise for being late. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that acknowledgement to other First Nations people joining us today. It is a privilege to speak to you tonight at the 15th Ron McCallum debate. And I just wanted to acknowledge the Emeritus Professor Ron McCallum, who has been a giant of labour law in this country. And I pay real tribute to his contributions made in many fields over his long and distinguished career, but particularly acknowledge him as a member of the panel that conducted the very first review of the Fair Work Act in 2012. Now, of course, there's a lot of very important people in the room, so I am going to just acknowledge a couple of people. Justice Adam Hatcher and Justice Morty Bromberg, thank you for your address. It's wonderful to join you. And everyone at the Australian Institute of Employment Rights, and thank you for having me here tonight. It is wonderful to be among a group of passionate people who are committed to improving our workplace relations system and making sure it worked. Now, I think I'm probably outnumbered here. I am not a Labor lawyer. In fact, I'm not a lawyer at all, as you heard from my background. But I was a worker and am a worker, but was a worker. My first interaction with the workplace relations system was when I was pretty young. I started working at 14 at a very big retail company. And at that time, Canberra was a very, very long way from Adelaide. And I went to work and I didn't really think about anything about just getting a pay packet and going home and studying and balancing work and life. It was not until my workplace offered me the newly introduced concept in 1998 of the Howard government, an individual workplace agreement, a contract which explicitly reduced my tea breaks and other things at work. Now, I was 19 at the time. I'd been working there for a little while and I thought I could negotiate that, and I tried to. I sat down with my union official and tried to say, well, this isn't quite fair. I'd like some extra tea breaks or a shorter period of time. I found out pretty quickly that that's not how it actually worked in practice. And indeed, pretty soon after that, I no longer had my casual job after being there for 5 years. I also quickly realised that I had options, and with the support of my union, I did go to the Industrial Relations Commission, where I think it was particularly important. It was the old Industrial Relations Commission because it was a little while ago, where I had the opportunity to turn up on an equal playing field with my employer and actually have a discussion about what the problems were, why I no longer were getting hours, and very soon actually got my job back. So having the laws and the impact of those laws were therefore not lost on me. And also having a place where I could go to enforce these laws really was critical. So it's not lost on me now, the responsibility I have a few decades later as the Minister for Workplace Relations to really ensure that our laws are fit for purpose and that they do have the opportunity for it to be working properly. But I'm also equally aware that everyone in this room is a really important part of the ecosystem, whether that is through advocating for legal change, whether that's interpreting or enforcing the law, or actually just using our legal frameworks. It is really important that we all do work together to make sure that we have the best workplace relations system in the country. Now, I feel tonight's topic is a particularly relevant one, because making our workplace relations system both fairer and more productive has really been at the heart of the government's agenda since we were elected. Because I fundamentally believe that the relationship between fairness and productivity is not mutually exclusive. When our government came to office 3 years ago, we did understand the urgency to act when it came to workplace relations reform, because it was clear that there were gaps in our laws in which people were falling through. Our reforms were designed to get wages moving, to improve gender equality and improve the security and safety at work, and to remove loopholes in the system that did undermine fairness, but were also impeding productivity. Because it is important that our workplace relations system does ensure that workers do get a fair go, but also encourages productive and cooperative workplaces. And I really do think that one of the best ways to achieve this is through enterprise bargaining. And that's why many of the reforms that we passed in our last term of government were to reinvigorate enterprise bargaining. And a number of reforms we made was to make the enterprise bargaining process easier. We did cut red tape for single enterprise bargaining. We provided more options for businesses and employees to make multi-enterprise agreements, particularly in low-paid industries. We made the Better Off Overall test simpler and fairer and more flexible. We strengthened the ability of the Fair Work Commission to resolve intractable bargaining disputes. Because really, ultimately, to drive more people, to support more people and drive better outcomes for workers, we needed to have both sides at the bargaining table. Now, I'm really pleased to see that we put out a quarterly report of bargaining. The latest available figures show that 2.8 million Australians are now covered by enterprise agreements. This is the highest number ever recorded since enterprise bargaining commenced back in 1991, and just in one quarter has increased from 2.67 million Australians. And what we're seeing is it delivering for workers. The average wage increase for agreements signed in the June quarter is 4.2%, which is well above the economy-wide average of 3.4%. Now, importantly, the enterprise bargaining is not just delivering the better pay and better conditions for workers, but it is, of course, allowing flexibility at an enterprise level, allowing for enhanced productivity for employers. But beyond the benefits to wages and conditions, and indeed the productivity benefits, I really believe the bargaining process itself improves understanding between the parties and provides agency to both sides. And of course, this leads to long-term productivity benefits at the workplace level. Now, of course, to ensure fairness and dignity at work, our country needs a strong safety net that underpins this bargaining. A safety net which does protect core rights and entitlements of workers, such as the employment standards and, of course, our modern award system. But it is also good for business. When we look at something like our same job, same pay provisions, it stops a race to the bottom, and it stops actually, in many cases, companies unable to compete when they are being outbid for contracts. So the same job, same pay provisions that we introduced were not just important for workers who are receiving pay increases as a result, but does provide a more level playing field for businesses around the country. Now, while in many cases employers and employees are able to work out issues at a workplace level and discuss these things, there are times where the law being explicit is very important. And that's why a few months ago we did pass legislation that would protect penalty rates and overtime rates for workers covered by modern awards. This does not exclude the ability to negotiate in an enterprise agreement, but it was a very important part to making sure the safety net stayed strong. And it's also why we introduced Baby Priya's bill, which passed through the Parliament just this week. This was a grey area that was making human resource people very confused about what their obligations were in the event of a stillbirth or early death of a child. Were they meant to pay parental leave? Were these people parents or were they not? And that created a lot of angst and a lot of distress in workplaces around the country. Through Baby Priya's bill, we were able to explicitly make clear if there were not provisions already in place at the workplace, then you could not cancel employer-funded paid parental leave in these events. What I've heard across the board, that this has cleared up a grey area at a time where certainty and clarity is critical. Now, a key point I make tonight and everywhere I go is, of course, our reforms are good for workers. We are a Labor government. But they have also been good for business, because when we talk about productivity, we can never talk about cutting pay as a road to productivity gains, because it's fairly obvious that when workers can see their wages growing in real terms and that their job is secure, they feel part of they have a stake in their employment, then they are more engaged, more motivated and committed. And I think this has been really borne out as a good example where it's been win-win for workers and employers through the explicit right to disconnect. Because the right to disconnect was about providing enhanced protections for workers, but it is also benefiting employers as well. A recent study from the Australian HR Institute indicated that more than half of employers say that the right to disconnect has improved engagement and productivity within their workforce. Now, I have said that we do achieve better productivity when we bring people together and different perspectives are brought to the table and discussed. And I think this is particularly true at an enterprise level, but I also think it is true at a national scale as well. When workers' unions and government come together in that tripartite fashion, I think it really does make a difference. And I think one institution that really has been truly tripartite and stood the test of time is Safe Work Australia, where employers, two levels of government and workers and their unions collaborate to develop the laws, policies and explanatory material to make sure our workplaces are safe. And I am, as Minister, very keen to look at more opportunities where we can have true structural tripartitism to bring everyone together. One of the ways we are looking at, we're starting to do this, is through industry-specific tripartite forums. And one example of this is the National Construction Industry Forum. Through the National Construction Industry Forum, believe it or not, I have unions sitting down next to the Master Builders Association, and they're actually getting on very well. They're engaging in a collaborative way rather than being adversaries. And in fact, they are finding out they have some more things in common than perhaps they first thought. But the governments, unions and employers have worked together to develop a blueprint of the future for this industry. The blueprint identifies priority challenges and sets out a way forward to address them. Now, I'm not pretending that any forums like this are a magic wand, but as I said, and the example I set out with enterprise bargaining, the process itself, by bringing the perspectives to the table, is driving areas where we can agree and areas where there is a clear divergence, but we understand each other. Now, fundamentally, our workplace relations system is about, at its heart, in my belief, providing dignity at work. And this audience knows better than anyone that work is more than just a job. It's about economic independence, it's about social connection and psychological well-being. But ensuring there is opportunity for a dignified, secure, well-paid job is also equally important. And as a government, we are absolutely committed to extending the opportunity to work as far as possible, ensuring those who are facing barriers to work, particularly secure, well-paid work, or are currently excluded from the labour market, are included. And I would like to acknowledge the advocacy by Professor McCallum in this space, both here in Australia and, of course, on the global stage. Like in everyday life, inclusive workplaces that actively remove barriers to include those that have been traditionally excluded from the benefits get a broader perspective at their workplace, and there is more innovation. Just one example, I was at a children's birthday party not long ago where I was speaking to an architect, and he talked about going out on his own with two people, and they were desperate for a draftsperson and they couldn't find one anyway. They went through Facebook and they found a deaf draftsperson, and his immediate thought was, oh, look, I'm going to take a hit. My business is going to take a hit, but We really need someone, and I'm doing the right thing. Well, he had an absolute change of heart when that person started working for him. There was no hit to the business. There was no economic hit that he took. In fact, it only enhanced his business. And that drafts person has not only brought their talents to the workplace, but has changed the way and the design and the added benefit that that business brings to their clients. So look, obviously extending the opportunity of work benefits the individual, but of course business benefits as well, and a great example of where everyone benefits. Of course, we know that businesses, for example, whose workforce includes people with disability, grow their profits more than 4 times faster than their peers. And an inclusive approach to hiring produces better functioning, better performing workplaces. And at a time when so many businesses are looking for workers, there's never been a better time to be breaking down those systemic barriers that have either kept people in lower paid jobs or indeed kept them out of the labour market altogether. Because people who bring their valuable lived experience and wealth of knowledge not only benefit the individual businesses, but of course benefit the broader economy. The economic dividend for a more inclusive Australia is estimated to be worth $12.7 billion every year. Now, of course, we know that there is more to do to make our workplaces more cooperative and to better represent the Australian population. And this is not a challenge government can tackle on its own. We all do need to work together to change cultural attitudes and break down barriers to ensure that we get the most harmonious, best functioning workplaces. But look, in conclusion, I'd just like to reiterate, like all of you, our government is committed to having the best workplace relations system we possibly can. Our reforms, we believe, have improved fairness and provide a foundation for unions, workers and their employers to work together to build a more productive economy that benefits all Australians. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.
I'll now hand over to Justice Hatcher from the Fair Work Commission to moderate the debate.
Thank you, James. I was very interested to watch that video of past debates. Firstly, I didn't realise I was competing with the likes of Yarn Event, so obviously the debate's gone a bit down market since then. And secondly, most of the ones I've attended so far have been very civilised, so I was interested to see that there was a bit of heat in some of the debates, so hopefully I can get that going this evening. So we're here tonight to discuss the relationship between fairness and productivity in the workplace. Do they go arm in arm? Can we enhance both simultaneously, or does one come at the price of the other? Fairness is well ingrained in the Australian consciousness as a fundamental national value, but it's a rather an elusive concept. At the birth of our industrial relations system at the beginning of the last century, fairness meant higher wages and job security for white male workers. It's now commonly regarded as embracing a much wider range of concepts, including workforce participation from female workers, Indigenous and disabled workers, freedom from bullying, sexual harassment and discrimination, elimination of gender-based undervaluation of work, and work and family life balance. But there's no commonly accepted metric for measuring fairness, and there's disagreement about whether we even have a problem, let alone what the solution might be. Productivity is on its face a more finite and identifiable issue. There's a well-accepted economic definition of productivity, output, that is output measured by gross value added divided by paid hours worked. So it's a mathematical calculation. And using this measure, Australia, like much of the Western world, has had a problem with weakening productivity growth over the last decade. A decade ago, the 20-year average productivity growth rate was 1.7%. It's now 0.8%. And the post-COVID years have seen actual reductions in productivity as we've faced the paradox of very strong employment growth, but also weak economic growth suppressed by high interest rates. So this gives rise to a series of questions. What is the cause of this? Has technological change stalled? Is there a lack of competition and competent management? Or is it over-regulation stifling business innovation and investment? Can we afford fair workplaces without at the same time improving productivity growth? Or are we even measuring productivity correctly? And should we take into account improvements in the quality and standard of health and other social services? And what reforms are necessary to improve both productivity and fairness in the workplace? So to hopefully give us the answers to all these difficult questions, James and his team have assembled a wonderful panel tonight, and I'll give each of them a very brief introduction. So Emma Dawson is the Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre, and earlier from 2016 to 2025, Emma was the Executive Director of the policy think tank Per Capita, of which she is a co-founder, and she's published reports and articles on a wide range of public policy issues, and has particular interests in economic inequality and social justice, gender equality, public interest media and labour rights. Steve Knott is the Chief Executive of the Australian Resources and Energy Employer Association, the leading employer organisation in the mining, oil and gas and related services sector, and has held that role since 1997. Steve's a fixture in the industrial relations landscape, and his voice, sometimes a very loud voice, on behalf of resources employers has been heard in almost every major industrial relations debate for as long as most of us can remember. Dr. Weisa Chow is the current Executive Director of Per Capita, a think tank focusing on addressing inequality. She is a respected leader with over 2 decades of experience across not-for-profit and government sectors, dedicating to advancing fairness, shared prosperity and social justice. Liam O'Brien is the Assistant Secretary of the ACTU. He's held that position since 2018, and before that, he was a senior official with the Australian Workers' Union. Liam, in his role, is responsible for leading the ACTU's policy, industrial and campaign work on work health and safety and workers' compensation matters. And he's a repeat performer at the Ron McCallum debate. So too is Anna Boucher, Associate Professor at the University of Sydney. She is the Chair of the Discipline of Government and International Relations in the School of Social and Political Sciences and is a global policy expert on migration and labour markets. Her research covers immigration, gender and racial diversity, inequality in labour market and regulatory change, as well as the skill selection of migrants. And finally, on the far left is Ian Coyle. He's the Adjunct Professor, School of Psychology and Public Health and School of Law at La Trobe University and also the Australian Catholic University Law School. Professor Coyle has had an extensive career as a forensic psychologist and has given expert evidence in and prepared expert reports for a wide range of criminal and civil matters in various areas, including personal injury and psychosocial safety. So we'll kick off the debate. So starting off with the topic of fairness. So I might start this off with 2 participants, Weisa Chow and Anna Boucher. How do we measure fairness in the workplace? What are the criteria and what does a fair workplace actually look like? So Weisa, do you like to have a go at that question?
It's always hard with the first question, but I think fairness is really about power imbalances. So when we think about what is fair, and if we think about how we actually create a fair workplace, we need to think about how we're actually practicing it, how we actually making sure that our values are actually turned into policies so that people actually feel like it's fair. And so in terms of measurement, I think, there's a whole range of ways to measuring fairness, but I think one of the key ways is really to look at people who are in a more vulnerable position and whether or not we see them in more senior roles, because what that means is that we think about career progression, and that people who have less power, you also see them in senior roles as well, and that they are actually getting the promotion that they deserve.
Right. Anna?
At a minimum, it's procedural fairness for everyone in the workplace, but as has been alluded to in the Minister's speech, sometimes we need reforms that, and Ron mentioned this as well, go deeper into more substantive forms of fairness. An example that we can reflect on is the Respect at Work reforms, obviously acknowledging, as that, was it Professor Katz in the video said, that the laws were there, but we were still having sexual harassment. So the Respect at Work reforms obviously attempting to take a deeper approach to fairness to alleviate that happening in workplaces, and we'll see in the evaluation whether that's been successful or not. Or we might think recently in the news, the last few days, racism in the workplace. Similarly, we have a Race Discrimination Act, we have protections in the Fair Work Act, but there's still a concern that racism is occurring. So on a deeper level, fairness would attempt to eradicate as much as possible those instances in the workplace.
And Anna, just follow up, do you have an idea how we measure these things? That is, how do we know whether we've made progress, whether we're going backwards, and whether what is currently in place is working or not working?
I'll give you an example from a recent report written by Settlement Services International, $1 billion benefit. And they look at all the reasons why recent migrants are working in jobs below their skill level and arguably earning less than they should be given their skill level. And they bring in a variety of controls in their analysis, such as the visa, the workplace, and what they find is there is an unexplained element. And they put that down. Deloitte, who wrote the report with Settlement Services International, puts that down to racism. Similarly, studies that the ILO has done on gender wage gaps, they look at all the possible explanations for why there is a gendered wage gap, and there's a gap. So you do it through standard statistical analysis, and once you can hold certain variables, then the unexplained component can generally be attributed to discrimination.
All right. Well, Liam O'Brien, so do we have fair workplaces? And if we don't, why not?
Well, it'd be odd for me to sit here and say that we do, because I'm hardly going to say the job's done. But to pick up on the points that were raised just then, when I think about fairness at work, I think about, come and take Justice Bromberg's invitation, I think about the fundamental principles and rights at work. So I think about the ILO fundamental principles. So freedom from discrimination, protections against forced and child labour, the right to a healthy and safe working environment, a new fundamental principle at work, and collective bargaining. And fundamentally, it's all about workers having agencies and workplace parties coming together. I think we are on a track to start to restore fairness. I think many of the changes that the Minister went through that were really about restoring collective bargaining are at its heart about restoring fairness in the workplace and giving workers more agency, something that I think for the better part of a generation was lost in this country. If we think about that and its relationship to productivity, which I'm sure we'll get to later, these two things are interdependent. You cannot achieve one without the other. And so I think, have we achieved fairness? I would say we are well on our way to restoring fairness in the workplace, but we have a lot of work to do in terms of bringing to life those fundamental principles and rights at work.
Well, we've had a Fair Work Act, a Fair Work Commission and a Fair Work Ombudsman for 15 years. What hasn't been working? Why aren't we there yet?
Well, I think, to the point, it was great to see Minister Burke, I suppose, his speech that he gave here 2 years ago, is that labour markets are dynamic. They change constantly. Loopholes emerge, and indeed over the last few years, indeed the last decades, we saw loopholes really being exploited that struck at the heart of fairness. And so I think ensuring that parliaments are giving you and the Fair Work Ombudsman and others the powers to address fairness in the workplace is really critical to ensuring that we continue to meet that task in the years ahead.
Does that mean that fairness is a target that we can say we've reached one day, or is it simply an ongoing task where it's one thing after another in the face of an evolving labour market?
I think what's really interesting, and this is possibly going a little off script here, which is possibly how you end up having these more spicy debates, but I think Australia's system is very unique. We have a Fair Work Commission that has an arbitral power which somehow comes to conjuring up fairness, whereas we look across the world, bargaining is at the heart of it. And so workers and employment parties determine fairness. And I think we have this hybrid system that does ensure that fairness evolves over time, that, with respect to your work, you're not the arbiter necessarily of fairness except at the right now. That potentially fairness changes over time, and so it should. To the points that were raised about gender, discrimination, racism, these are evolving things in Australia and we need to be progressing towards resolving them. And I think fairness is not something that is static.
All right, well, perhaps we'll now start to generate some heat. So, Steve Knott, do we actually have a problem with fairness in Australian workplaces? Or are we selling ourselves short compared to international peers when we say that we haven't reached fair workplaces yet?
Well, I'll answer that in two parts. I saw on the screen there before Joseph Benedict Hockey, and I'm conscious it's been recorded, so I won't tell you the whole story. But he was the IR minister when they got rid of work choices. And Julia Gillard was the shadow minister at the time, and we had her in our board meeting with our board members. And someone came and got me and said, "Oh, the minister wants to speak to you." And Joe's on the phone, and he said, "Oh, we're getting rid of work choices. We're going to have a fairness test." And I said, "Well, what's that, Joe?" And he goes through it, and it sounds a lot like the no disadvantage test. Why don't you just go back to the old no disadvantage test? Well, obviously somebody further up the line didn't like that, so we had a fairness test, and since then we've had the Fair Work Commission, Fair Work Ombudsman, you name it, everything's got to be fair. So, look, from a fairness point of view, I don't think the IR legislation, we're with it, it's not going to change much into the future. If you're in big companies, you'll find your way around it and you'll learn how to work with it. Small and medium businesses will do what they always did and still do. The small business will ignore a lot of the laws and survive, and some of them will comply with the laws. But the real piece, and I was talking to Ron about this before when I first met him in 1997, in Hobart, the guy who was one of my two career mentors, a guy called late Terry Palmer, he ran Camalco Smelting, and I was having a sook. I'd been the IR manager of the Hydro, 6,000 employees, 20 awards, 20 unions, in the commission every day. And the union, which today is now called the CFMEU, was jacking up one of our sites. And I said, "Oh, the union won't let us do something." So he pulled me aside and he drew two triangles. First triangle at the top was, you can put shareholders in there if you like, board, executive, and at the base of the triangle were employees. Then he went over to Liam's mod, which was the trade union, and he had up there the state and federal secretary, the officials, the delegates, and down the base of the triangle, the bulk, was members. And he drew an arrow across from the employees to the members of the union. So if someone in my business, he said, tells me that the union won't let me do something, I've got a problem with my leadership, because they've got the employees, whether it's 38, 35, or in our industry, 42 hours a week, and the unions are in and out. So they've got a choice. They're going to follow the union leadership, or they're going to find the company leadership. And I think if you've got the leadership piece right, all the transactional stuff in the IR system, and employees having a fair treatment system and recourse. The other thing that they set up, which was different, which is away from the same job, same pay. I have no issue with the same job, same base pay stuff. But we introduced a report. Ron, we actually asked you to have a look at this in 1999, which was beyond enterprise bargaining. Our industry was past it by then. So they wanted to do performance assessment and performance review with all their employees. So you know yourself, if you've got a carpenter at your place and doing a job, and then someone else comes and does another extension, the quality of the work might be different. You might want to pay one more than the other. So our industry sort of stepped away from enterprise bargaining. They're getting dragged back in now because where they had expired enterprise agreements, some were EFAs under the Keating era in 1993. They're now going back into the system because they are required to. And some of them think that it's some benefit for protection from industrial action. But as everyone around here tells you, the industrial action statistics in Australia are extremely low, and they have been since when I first started in the IR space in 1980. The trend has been continuously down. So I think it's a leadership piece, Justice Hatcher, and to make sure that there's fairness in the workplace, and the employees and indeed the trade unions, if that's not there, they'll gravitate to the trade unions, and you'll know about it and it won't be good for your business.
Well, just a follow-up question. So we've obviously had a bit of discussion about fairness to employees. Do you think the current system is fair to employers?
Really quick, how many countries in the world have got an industrial award system? You know, 0, right? Last time there was an industrial country with an industrial award system was in New Zealand in 1991, and they got rid of it with the Employment Contracts Act. How many awards are there in Australia? 120, continuing to grow. How many words in them? 2 million. How many words in the pages in the Fair Work Act now? 2,200 and something. The first act in 1904 had 69 pages in. So can we get ChatGPT to simplify the Fair Work Act? And if we got rid of the awards, and the Coalition had an opportunity to do this in 2004 and back in the 70s when they had control of the Senate, they mucked it up. They could have had a deeming provision, so everybody that was on awards, they wouldn't lose money. You could have had a system over here where you could have the Fair Work Commission with Justice Hatcher, Commissioner Hunt over there. People could play around in that with awards and agreements and all the rest of it. Others could have individual employment arrangements, performance assessments and so forth. WA had that in 1993 and it was very successful. That opportunity came and went. They took, the late Kevin Andrews took too long to introduce legislation in 2004 and took too much advice from blue chip law firms and they overcomplicated it. And it was too late. So that's not going to happen in our lifetime, not in my lifetime anyway. Some of you are a bit younger than me, it may happen, but the awards are here to stay. They're extremely complex. I just put down some of the companies here and I could go on more. ABC, BHP, Westpac, Woolworths, Coles, the Minister's own department. They've all been in breach of the industrial award system that we currently have. So if the biggest private sector company, BHP, can't get it right, the ABC with over $1 billion, the Minister's own department, what hope has a small to medium business got?
So it's not fair?
Well, it's there.
All right. All right, now we're cooking, I think. So, Emma Dawson, are there winners and losers in the fairness stakes, and who do you think is doing well in the current system and who is doing less well, and why?
Yes, there are winners and losers. I think, to answer the question directly, workers are doing better now than they were in the previous decade. So a lot of the changes that the Minister talked about, they have got wages moving again. For example, between the 10 years to 2022, I think the wage share of national productivity dropped by about 3.8% and the profit share rose by 6.4%. That has since reversed in the last 5 years. So we are seeing, I think, a restoration of some fairness to the system. It's fundamental to how Australia not only operates, but how we think of ourselves. So, you know, several people have mentioned the fair go and that it's such an important ethos in Australia. And I think it is critical to remember that we led the world in workers' rights. If you want to go back to 1856, when I'm from Melbourne. Melbourne led the world in workers' rights. The stonemasons in 1856, who were arguing for the 8-hour day, and they made that argument very explicitly in favour of having not just rest but leisure and the time to pursue intellectual pursuits and be an informed part of democracy. 1907, you saw the Harvester Judgment, which was, again, the first setting down in legal precedent of the concept of a minimum wage. And as you rightly said at the start, these laws at those times were focused on the white male worker, but Justice Higgins, with the Harvester Judgment, made clear that a wage should be provided to a worker to provide for himself and his family in frugal comfort, regardless of the employer's ability to pay. So these things, these concepts of fairness and the rights of workers actually underpin Australian egalitarianism, I would say, much more so than in European countries and in the US. In a capitalist society, employment is the major means by which we distribute wealth. And I would argue that those strong workplace rights underpinned what was known internationally as the working man's paradise for much of the 20th century. But, as Liam said, labour forces change, the demands of the economy change, and I would say, we saw this most recently with the judgment against Westpac in the work from home decision, that the concept of work as being something you do for pay shifting as more women enter the workforce in particular, and as the need to recognise that we have for over a century ignored the contribution of unpaid and domestic work, and how that affects people's well-being. So fairness is important because if we think about the purpose of productivity and the purpose of growth, it's meant to be to improve our lives, to lift our living standards. And that doesn't just mean having more money to buy stuff. It means having time, having a sense of community, having a sense of purpose and belonging. And I think traditionally Australia and Australians themselves still see workplace relations very much through that lens. So over the last 40 years globally, 40 to 50 years, we've seen a retreat from that concept of work as being part of life, and a much more explicit shift towards shifting the risk of making money away from employers and onto employees, reducing workers' bargaining power, but also expecting people to work a lot more. And I think for a similar standard of living. One of the things that I think people don't take account of enough is that when we first started doing the labour force series, it was about 1980, Mark, something like that, only around a third of women were in the workforce. By the year 2000, that was up to around about half, and it's now at an all-time high of 63.1%. And critically, the increase in the number of women in the workforce just this century, so since 2000, of women of childbearing age, women between, say, 25 and 45, that's up by 15%. So the amount of work households are putting into the economy to have a similar standard of living over the last 25 years is arguably more than we recognise, because we're not, for example, we say it costs 16 times household income today to buy a house. In 2000 it was 9 times, but we're not looking at the additional hours. So I'm waffling a bit, but the point I'm trying to make is that original concept that came from the stonemasons, that came from the Harvester judgment, that said work should contribute to a good life, and that the realm outside of paid work is to be considered when we think about fairness in the workplace. That was almost a uniquely Australian position, and it's more important now than ever, because actually households are pretty much at their capacity for how many hours of paid and unpaid work they can take on. So I think there is further to go in how we think about time as well as income.
Well, just on gender, as a follow-up, just on gender issues specifically, you pointed out that we've reached a historic high in terms of the percentage of women participating in the workforce. And also recent data suggests there's been significant progress in narrowing the gender pay gap. Are we on the right track, or what else needs to be done in that space?
Statistics can mask things. So one of the reasons the gender pay gap's narrowing is that male earnings are falling a little bit. More women are working full-time, although they still predominantly work part-time in Australia compared to other nations. But a lot of what this government's done in recognising the undervaluing of female-dominated industries, particularly the care economy, so those jobs that work that used to be in the domestic realm and was seen as is not valued at all, is explicitly excluded from GDP, for example. As it's moved into the paid realm, we continue to undervalue it. So the investment in increased wages for care workers has been really important. We're making steps in the right direction, and it's not coincidental that it's under the first gender equal federal government we've ever had. So we are making steps in that right direction. Flexible work is important for women. But one thing, I don't think we're thinking as boldly as we used to, and perhaps because of the loss of the power of organised labour, the very deliberate reduction of that over 40 years. Why, for example, did we stop fighting for shorter working hours in 1983? Keynes said in 1930 that we'd all be working 15 hours a week by now because of the productivity gains. And he was right about the productivity gains. We have increased productivity by the amount he predicted. But we're actually working on average about 43 hours a week in this country. And that's not entirely choice. You know, the Productivity Commission has suggested, my friend Andrew Lee said recently, well, Australians chose to take that productivity gain in goods and services. But we're not making those choices in a vacuum. And when house prices are going up as they are and the costs of the basics are going up, a lot of people are working more hours than they'd like to. And there's actually evidence to show that people who can afford it, there was a headline in The Australian a couple of months ago, is this the world's first part-time CEO? You know, people that are wealthy are choosing to pull their hours back. Not everyone has that ability, particularly if you're working in the gig economy or in an underpaid, atomised, casualised, feminised industry. So I do think there's further to go there, and I personally believe that the time has come for the 4-day week. The time has come to reduce the standard working week with no loss of pay, to recognise that those inputs to productivity, such as having the bills paid and the floors cleaned and your meals prepared and your clothes washed, are actually foundational to your ability to be productive in the first place. So things are better over the last 5 years. The forces of reaction are strong. Business is pushing very hard for people to get back into the office, back into the CBD. What it fails to recognise is that we don't have the labour force we had in the 80s or 90s. People do not have a wife at home, and the demands of really asset price inflation mean that we need to think more holistically about how families, not women, families manage the demands on their time, both paid and unpaid.
All right. Ian Coyle, so what barriers do you see in terms of workplace cultures, workplace behaviours, workplace safety systems to achieving fairer workplaces?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because I've been sitting here thinking you're missing the big ticket item. To improve workplace relations and make them more productive requires objective assessment of job demands, which includes work pressure, physical demands, emotional demands, bullying, harassment, and work and family conflict. Now, all of those demands and issues need to be considered if you're going to manage effectively workplace health and safety issues. But interestingly, this is most effectively done in the context of objective assessment of job resources, health and work outcomes. This has been the subject of extensive work-based research since the 1980s, with the pioneering work of Dr. Zohar, Z-O-H-A-R. I first published in that area back in 1995 in a paper called Safety Climate. Originally, there was a concept of management climate. That is, management of a company created a climate in which people worked in. It's either a good management climate or a bad management climate. People liked working there or they didn't, at its two extremes. But as is always the case, it's much more complex than that. A subset of management climate, which incidentally was something that was readily sold by consultancy companies in the 1980s to senior management. We will assess your management climate and tell you how you can improve relations. We know how to do this because we've developed these questionnaires that have been used in countless organisations over the past 2 decades. And they would come in and charge a lot of money to administer the same questionnaire. It didn't work. There's no surprise about that, because companies are different, the people in them are different, the organisational structure is different, and to argue that you can have one-size-fits-all model approach to assessing management climate was just nonsense. It's now moved on to safety climate. We can have one-size-fits-all model to measure safety climate, and more recently in Australia, which has been brought into or legislated, we have psychosocial safety climate. So we're getting more and more narrow as we go along. Well, what does psychosocial safety climate mean? Well, it means the management structure, the way in which people are remunerated, the way in which people are dealt with, the way in which job descriptions, if they exist, are written, who's responsible for supervising and operating in different parts of the business and so on. Now, that all seems quite reasonable. You can come up with some standard questionnaires, except that you can't, because each organisation has got its own particular management and organisational structure, and it's got its own psychosocial structure. It's worthwhile and it's necessary to get some objective assessment of that if we're going to see how we can improve things. Back in 1990, myself and some colleagues looked at studies of the Anglican Nursing Society and the Anglican Home Retirement Villages. We conducted a number of what are called Delphi processes or interviews to determine what people at various levels in the organisation thought were the most important things. And from those, we developed some questions and administered questionnaires to these two arms of the Anglican Church. Anglican Home Mission Society, dealing with retirees if you like, Anglican Home and Nursing Society, dealing with retirees who really need a lot of care. And we got totally different results. Not surprising when you think about them, but back then no one had thought that that was possible. Now that was in 1990. I've only recently, the past 5 years, gone back into this field. I've been doing other things. And one of the things I did was look at how many articles have been published. And this is literally mind-numbing. Well, it was to me when I looked at it this morning. If we look at the number of research articles in 1990, when I published with my two colleagues, one of whom's deceased, he probably put up with too much of my bad humour, I should say. There were 41,000 research articles in the world dealing with safety, climate and performance. Performance at work. As of yesterday, on Google Scholar, there were 4,320,000 articles published on the same in the same area. 4,320,000 articles. Now, no matter how good you are as a research scientist, no matter what filters you apply to that, that's a mind-numbing task to consider that you're going to look at a representative sample of all of them. It's an evil concept. Fortunately, there is a way out of it that the legislature does not seem to have appreciated, certainly in New South Wales. I think that's a...
I'll just give us what the answer is.
Sorry.
We're all waiting with bated breath.
Stop for me. Fortunately, there is a way out of it, and that's to narrow things down to particular industries and particular companies and say, we can't have a global safety climate assessment. Things don't work that way. Humans are different. The jobs they do work in are different. We can have some elements that are transferable from one industry to another, but we can't have a general one-size-fits-all model. It doesn't work that way. But is it needed? Well, yes, and I'll leave you with one last thing. One might wonder what the United States, America's Pacific Fleet is doing with respect to safety climate. Well, they just did a major survey of 27,000 sailors dealing with safety climate. Now, for the US Pacific Fleet to consider that to be of importance, insofar as it goes to the issue of helping defend America, pretty well says it all as far as I'm concerned. That's where we need to put some effort in, because it brings together organisational psychology, law and employment relations into one issue that is fundamental. How do we do things better and make things safer?
All right, well, let's turn to productivity. So I touched upon some of the data about Australia's national productivity growth performance, Liam. We do have a problem, don't we? And just to follow up, how can we fix some of the fairness issues we've identified unless we get better at creating and growing national wealth.
Well, let's start with I suppose the premise of this debate is there a trade-off between productivity and fairness? And we would say absolutely there is not. The two are interdependent, they are related. You cannot have productivity without ensuring fairness. In fact, I think what happens too often in this country is productivity is used by some to really describe what is profitability. The idea that workers need to work harder for less and that is how we have a road to greater national prosperity. And I think the point that Emma and others raised is really clear, is that unless workers feel that they have some agency, i.e. some reward in the return for effort, the productivity will never eventuate. If we look at the productivity debt that Australian workers are in at the moment, Dr. Jim Stanford puts that at something like $200,000 each worker is owed in terms of the productivity they have not shared in for the last 2 decades. That's a huge loss in income for many workers in this country. Largely off the back of, to others' points, the fact that we have not addressed the way in which labour markets operated in a way that ensures that we retain fairness. Now, we firmly believe that fairness is critical to ensuring national prosperity. Absolutely, productivity is also critical to ensuring long-term a lift in living standards. But if workers do not feel that they are going to get their share at the other end of this, then productivity will never eventuate. And I think what we've had over the last decade has actually been a missing of the real problems when it comes to productivity. We've seen a massive underinvestment in skills and training in this country. We have seen something close to 14% decline on 2007 figures in terms of business investment and training. It's not surprising that 1 in 3 occupations are in shortage. That's a huge problem. We've basically seen a complete walking away from research and investment by business in this country, a huge driver of productivity. But more importantly, we've effectively seen a capital strike in this country. And if you had powers to essentially deal with that, there'd be a huge problem for business because business has not invested in capital stock in this country. The 3 key things that would lift productivity: skilling workers, being at the leading edge of research and innovation, but also investing in technology in this country. Those are the things that drive productivity. And indeed, those are the things that historically have driven productivity. If we think about the decades gone, if we return to the scary days that Steve says we're heading to now, the 60s and the 70s, we had productivity between 2 and 2.5%. We had a workforce that was 50% unionised. We essentially had centralised, wage fixation, but yet we had much higher productivity growth. Today, we've deregulated labour markets, we've had a deliberate strategy of quashing unions, and productivity is declining. So I think, this idea that there's some sort of trade-off between fairness and productivity completely obscures what's really driving productivity in this country.
All right, so Steve Knott, business is not investing. They're not investing in capital, they're not innovating, and they're not training their workers. I've also heard from the ACT, I think in some public announcement, they think part of our productivity problem is poor management skills. What's your response to that?
Oh, look, the management leadership side of things, start with that first. That can always get better. And so companies that invest in their people, they can be your frontline supervisors through to your CEOs, board members, absolutely. 100% agreement with Liam in terms of productivity and fairness. You have to have both. Productivity without fairness, it doesn't build great workplaces. But if we don't have productivity, then the pie gets smaller, and we're seeing what we're getting now. Inflation's up and real wage growth not keeping up with inflation. So there's a fair bit of that. In terms of the capital strike, that's absolutely happening. We've put out a forecast in there. So our sector, for those that don't know, it's mining, oil and gas, and there's a third of the business called service contractors. So companies like Compass and Sodexo, they employ about 500,000 people globally. You'll have somebody blowing something up, specialists, all the rest of it. So it's quite a diverse. So if I look at the capital strike, there was a lady, and I am conscious this is being recorded, she was my vice president not all that long ago, but she's the CEO of Woodside. In my view, she's the best CEO in Australia, a lady called Meg O'Neill. Now, they're trying to get up the Northwest Shelf project, the expansion up there. It's been going on for 7 years. Now, she's from the US. She's approved a project in Louisiana and it got up in a fraction of the time. So you just got to follow the money. Even in our sector, though, in the next 5 years, we'll continue to have another $109 billion worth of investment, another 100,000 direct and indirect jobs. But we're already starting to see investment leave Queensland because of the coal royalty regime. It's not competitive. Some of that money's moving to New South Wales. A lot of it's moving overseas. The one that Kevin Rudd and the hairy-nosed wombat guy, Ken Henry, who was the head of Treasury, they never got right with the mining super profits tax. They more focused on the name of the tax, but they thought that capital's not mobile. In our sector it is. Just look at the guys in the nickel mines and the ladies in the nickel mines in the West who lost their jobs. I spoke to the Tasmanian Premier last Friday, and Michael knows that I grew up down that way, and I asked him about the future of the 3 smelters down there and the last paper mill we have in Australia. Because when I was at the hydro, we gave them their electricity for nothing. They came down, and that was the thing. The transport costs were all offset by the electricity costs. Up here, some people call it Tomago and others call it Tomago. They're in the gun as well. So all those jobs in the next 10 years, particularly in a place like Tasmania, that'll be huge. They'll be lost. And where are they going? They're going to our competitors overseas. Why? Because they have cheap energy. Why? Because they use our coal, our uranium and our gas. It's absolutely nuts. But the approval times on these projects is just ridiculous. In New South Wales, there was a gold mine here that you had an activist environment minister knocked it off after the state government approved it. There's jobs and $1 billion to pay for schools and hospitals that's gone wanting over a spurious blue banded bee thing that you can find anywhere in New South Wales and up in the ACT. It's a nonsense. So the market knows that. So the capital for these big projects in our industry come from overseas. When the North West Shelf started, we got $5 million from the 4 Australian banks. And that was the NAB. Westpac are out there virtue signaling all the time. I know they've got a bit of an issue with the work from home issue. And my personal view on that is the CEO of that company would be earning 10 times, 20 times more than what Liam's old mate, Tom Roberts, who's now a Deputy President of the Fair Work Commission. They should be able to make that decision. Now, that issue may be subject to appeal, so I don't want to go into it too much. But if we're going to say that these things from business, their rights to run their business, is being outsourced to public servants, apart from Justice Hatcher here, they're all administrative tribunal members. It's going to be outsourced to these people that have never run a business before, never had to raise capital, wouldn't know how high a haul pack tyre was, what it's like to travel on a chopper and go into an offshore oil rig. You know, it's absolutely barking mad. And so if those barriers start to be put up, then the money flows offshore.
All right. Well, Anna Boucher, what do you see as the drivers of productivity growth in the Australian workplace? Are we looking at capital investment, upskilling the workforce, greater managerial flexibility, as Steve seems to be advocating for, or something else?
I don't think the evidence is conclusive that regulation has caused the issues in productivity. So I read the review of the Secure Jobs Better Pay Act, Appendix 4, and there's an interesting diagram that suggests there's a slight reduction in productivity after the introduction of that legislation. But of course, this is just a correlation. And we've also seen, for instance, when the Fair Work Act was introduced, that productivity increased. So I don't think you can make the argument necessarily that increased regulation of the labour market in terms of fairness aspirations leads to a reduction in productivity. It seems probably more likely related to some of the factors that Liam has mentioned. There's also a question, which I think has been under-analysed, whether some aspects of low-skilled migration could be contributing to it. There was an interesting study done by E61 that showed that there are companies that have low productivity and where potentially workers, often of migrant background, are being underpaid. And those companies, which really shouldn't be in operation because they're not abiding by labour laws, arguably could be contributing to the overall lower productivity. So I think there's a question about fairer provision of labour standards to migrants, and also ensuring that these companies can't stay in operation if they're not abiding by those standards.
Right, Wayser Chow. So the whole notion of productivity and the way we measure it, Is the standard economic measure of productivity a reliable indicator of economic progress, or does it miss some things out, like improvements in social services, improvements in worker wellbeing? Should we move to some broader wellbeing index which takes into account factors other than the simple mathematical equation I talked about?
Well, I think if we, like I mentioned before, like when we talk about fairness, it's really about the power imbalance. And just looking at some of the stats, so the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2018 did a research and look at the cost of sexual harassment. And that costed our country $3.8 billion. And you know, that's a huge amount of money. And if we have a look at racism, there was also another research done by Deakin University to show that it means that we lose approximately 3% of our GDP. So again, that's a huge amount of money. If we can address some of these issues, we could be looking at an increase in productivity, just having better managers. Just having managers who are able to deal with these issues within the organisations, so that people are not experiencing, or even if people are experiencing sexual harassment and racism, that it's actually addressed. So anecdotally also, that there's a lot of people who experience these events, but organisations don't deal with it. And I call it systemic gaslighting, where when organisations actually put it on the victims themselves, and usually what happens is the victims themselves actually leave the organisation rather than perpetrators, and then they go on and do it to somebody else. And just looking at migrants being paid less, so we know that about 16% of recent migrants are actually paid less than the national minimum wage, and that's compared to about 9% for all workers. So again, just looking at recent migrants, looking at people from different cultural backgrounds, looking at women, all people who are impacted negatively by, even though we've got the employment laws, that they're not always protected by these laws. And at the same time, if we think about particularly women, there's a lot of unpaid work as well. And so this is not counted in the productivity. If we start counting productivity in those sense, we're probably going to look at a lot of money that we need to pay women who actually do a lot of domestic work. So when we start to look at the issue in a broader sense, we start to see that there's a lot of imbalances within our system, and those needs to be addressed as well.
All right. One of the issues that's been raised as an inhibitor of employee investment in productivity, and this is the point Liam raised, is a past failure for productivity benefits to flow through to the wages of workers. Emma Dawson, do you agree with that analysis, and what might we do to fix that in future? You particularly referenced before a 4-day week as a way to deal with or pass on the benefit of productive improvement. How do we go about doing that?
Again, so it's coming back to what is the purpose of productivity growth? And we've been told, in no uncertain terms, we've focused on this because it's about living standards. Productivity growth doesn't automatically flow to improved living standards. It only does so if we share the benefits adequately with working people. And it's absolutely true. I think Jim Stanford's analysis and the analysis that we did ourselves recently, just before I left, per capita showed, if wages had grown in line with productivity growth as they did in the 1980s and 90s, a young person in their 30s today would have the deposit for a home over the last 10 years. So that benefit has not been shared. And so people, and particularly young people, are now thinking, well, why? I've done everything right. I got my degree. I'm working really hard. I'm not getting the benefits. And so they do start to pull back from wanting to work full time because they're not seeing a return on that. So I think ensuring that we share it is critical. But it does go to the points that you were just talking about, Wazer, and that key question about how we're measuring productivity growth. So a couple of years ago, the Productivity Commission came out and said there'd been no productivity growth in the early childhood education and care sector since the turn of the 21st century. But as I alluded to earlier, in that time, women's workforce participation's gone up by 12%. So we're measuring productivity in the way that Adam Smith came up with it 250 years ago, which is what's the most efficient way to make a pin? You can have an artisan that does every step from mining the metal to refining the metal to carving it to polishing it, or you can have a production line, and a production line's much more efficient. That measure of productivity doesn't work in the fastest growing segment of our economy, which is care and services. You could say, well, a nurse is now serving 15 patients where before she was serving 10. That's on paper, that's a productivity gain. But if 6 of them are suffering because she can't provide them with adequate or timely care, then that is not a gain in terms of an improved living standard. So the way that we measure productivity growth, particularly in care and services, is inadequate. There is some shift on this globally. You talked about wellbeing metrics. Our own Productivity Commission under Chair Danielle Wood, who's a little bit more forward-thinking on this than some of her predecessors, is starting to look at quality-adjusted measurements in health and education, for example. But a really great example of this is if you look at the early childhood question and say, okay, well, we can either have a woman care for her children at home for 5 years. She may be a qualified engineer or an architect, and she would be much better at applying those skills in the economy. She's actually not very good at reading bedtime stories and doing Play-Doh, and she's not very good at educating and nurturing the minds of young people. Let's give that to a qualified person. Then if you started to say, in that scenario, currently under measured productivity, we're seeing a decline. But if we measured that differently, the real productivity growth combines both the investment in that child, which we know returns at least $2 for every dollar invested over the lifetime, but also the productivity benefits of the woman fulfilling her best abilities, of meeting her full potential. And so measurement needs a big rethink. GDP was invented because we needed to know how we were going to pay for the Second World War, basically. What resources do we have that can be put to that? And there was a decision that domestic work was not relevant to that. We cannot continue to these metrics are important, they're necessary, but they're no longer sufficient. So to ensure that the benefits of productivity are shared, people's lives do improve, then we need to think much more holistically about what are inputs to the economy. It's not just the number of paid hours you work, which is the formal measure of productivity. It's the input that you're making across your whole life and what you're getting in return.
So Steve Knight, just taking up that point again about sharing the gains of productivity improvements, how do you see that we can incentivise workers so that they can be more invested in collaborating with the employer to improve productivity? Can we have profit sharing arrangements so you're attracted to the 4-day week as a reward for better productivity? Do you have any ideas about that?
I've got to say, it's actually nuts. There's some Green senator today introduced something to say that you've got to be 2 days at home. You know, you tell that to the poor old cow who needs to be milked, or the guy who's out on the oil rig, you've got to sit there for a couple of days before you start again. So it's just nuts. It might work in some areas. Most businesses had the hybrid model in place before COVID. Some have extended that, so there's a place for it, and each business will work it out. On the profit sharing stuff, Your Honour, our industry has been doing that in some segments since last century. So having share ownership schemes. So if you've got, it's different if you've got a principal who's got a workforce that's stable and they want to do what they can to attract, retain, motivate their workforce. They have performance, these are blue-collar workers, performance assessment, performance review, share ownership schemes. So they're very much, they don't save up things to the next round of enterprise bargaining, they have a continuous improvement approach. So everybody's invested in the performance of the business and they get a share. So they've been doing that since last century. In other areas where they're highly unionised and they're there for a short period, like big construction jobs, it's a different thing. You've got to set up milestone completion bonuses if you want something to be finished on time, and that'll feed into redundancy payment. So basically, from a management point of view and a leadership point of view, you've got to think of ways. Some will be the benefits that have been talked about in terms of work from home and other benefits that are available. Where it's possible, there'll be shorter working weeks and all those sort of things, and others will be cash through milestone completion bonuses. So I think it's already happening, but it's not advertised a hell of a lot. Other sectors are trying to do it, and they are meeting with some success. But if they've got skin in the game, that makes a difference. So you've got some organisations, I won't name them, but they have job delegates that they have as their own internal supervisors. So they work with the trade unions so that they know what's going on in the business, what the competitive pressures are, what the price of the metal is or whatever it is, and in commodities, they go up and down, we know that. So they're really invested in all that. So when the officials come to site, they're educating the officials on what the company's actually doing. And that works quite well for some companies, and their productivity rates have been higher than some where they have no union involvement. So it's horses for courses, but at the end of the day, it's the leadership in the business that needs to think these things through and do what works for their enterprise and whatever business they're in.
So one follow-up question, it might be the last chance to start an argument here. Justice Bromberg and Liam O'Brien talked about the benefits of tripartism, collaboration with unions and workers' voices as a means of improving productivity. So what's your view about that? Is that the key to unlocking productivity, or is it a roadblock to productivity?
Have any of you been to the ILO down there? Or some that were here before Morty would have been there. It's like the Super Bowl of the IR club. Okay, so dealing with the CFMEU is a walk in the park. Dealing with the French government, pretty challenging. Okay, so but a lot of those things from that ILO perspective, they drip down and find their way to Australia. The Minister was here earlier, and it's been in the press on page 1 and 2. I've suggested that now is probably the time to go to a tripartite process to select future Fair Work Commission members. If you go back, the stacking of the tribunal started in 1993 when Bill Kelty had the super union approach, and the two unions got together and there was a surplus union official and they found their way into the system. And then John Winston Howard came in, and I think he might have employed one from the union side when he was there. And then, of course, Julia Eileen Gillard came in and it went back the other way. And since the current mob have been there, they've made 21 or 22 appointments. 21 have been ex-union or Labor-left law firms. So the red team are in the majority at the moment. They've got 29 and the blue team have got 25. I thought, well, maybe they should go back to the days, and Ron will remember these guys like Bert Evans and Brian Noakes, and they'd sit around the table with the department and Bill Kelty and Bob Hawke before that, and they'd say, well, this one's going. Oh, he was a union guy. Do we need to put another one? Yeah, we might. He was an employee. Oh, maybe we need somebody that can come in here and educate the Commission with their national wage about productivity. We might have an economist. We might have somebody dealing with gender equality issues and so forth, and look at the competency set of the tribunal. Why is that so weird? So, look, I think, I don't know whether the Minister's up for it or not, but we had a good discussion about it, and the social partners will talk about that. But if ever there's a time to go back to looking at the skills and competency of the tribunal, now's the time. And one other quick one, which some people in the tribunal think it was a cunning plan, Baldrick. I've recently suggested that the age of the Fair Work Commission members should go to 70. Why is it that at 65 in the Fair Work Commission, you're deemed to be senile? Sorry, Jennifer, you'll be senile at 65. But if you're on the court, you can go through to 70. Now, I get the problem with the High Court because that's in the Constitution, I think, Ron, and who's going to have a referendum if you want to extend it beyond 70. But the Productivity Commission in 2015 recommended the age of the tribunal members should go to 70, the same as the Circuit Court, Federal Court and High Court. And I think that's a discussion that I'll ask our guys to put on the National Workplace Relations Consultative Committee, and they kick that, whether they do it in a year or 2 years' time. But I just think it's nuts that people are forced out at age 65. And I think it was nuts, Ron, when you were made Senior Australian of the Year when you were only 61 or 62. you should have been the Australian of the Year.
All right. Well, that was a bit off topic, I must say. But all right, we've got to wrap up soon, so I'm just going to go across the table, and I want you, each of you, quickly, starting with you, Ian, to identify one big policy reform that you can identify that would simultaneously advance productivity and fairness in the workplace.
One simple one would be this. Look at safety management in its general terms as one of the best chances to increase productivity at virtually no cost. If it's done effectively, it's highly advantageous to productivity and reducing expenditure. If it's done poorly, the obverse obtains. And that requires some training in how to go about measuring these psychological concepts that actually impact upon productivity. That needs to be done. There's a lot of research on it, but it needs to be brought out into the community.
Right. Anna?
It's not simple, but 20% of Australians every year are affected by racism in the workplace. It costs the economy $37 billion a year. It affects people's health, turnover, psychosocial injury, heart disease, absenteeism, litigation. It's bad for morale and compensation. So we know that the best workplaces in the world, NASA, Silicon Valley, they're also the most multicultural and they manage diversity the best. So we need to not only reduce racism, but we also need to think about cultural interaction in the workplace and the benefits of it.
All right, Liam?
Look, it's hard not to talk about health and safety. 500,000 workers get injured every year at work. That is a huge loss in productivity, but it's also a national disgrace considering, that is such a huge proportion of the workforce. But I actually want to come back to the point I raised about skills, because if we think about the sort of future horizon, skills is where it's at. That is the only way a country as developed as Australia is going to succeed into the future, is a better skilled, better educated workforce. We need to do something about employer investment in training. It has collapsed in this country. In 1993, the Keating government introduced a national training levy. It massively increased training in this country. It's good for workers, it's good for business, it's a win-win, but also in a time when literally people are leaving school and going to be working into the 2070s and 2080s, we're going to need to equip people for lifelong learning, and we have not got a system to do it at the moment. And employers, as I said, have just completely walked away from this. And that's a key opportunity for both improving equity, but also improving productivity.
Right, Wayser.
Well, what I would like to see is to in order to address cultural diversity and supporting people from different cultural backgrounds, is to have flexible public holidays. Now, some workplaces already offer something like this, but I also hear, for example, that for some people who are wanting to access their flexible holiday, that they have to justify that the day is actually culturally significant to them. So I think if we can allow that people from different cultural backgrounds to be able to have holidays that is significant to them, that supports cultural diversity, but also helping people feel belong in the workplace and be supported as well.
Right, Steve, I wasn't sure whether retirement age was your big eye.
I am just older than you. Anyway, congratulations on getting your PhD, Doctor. So well done. Well, I'm on a Unity ticket with Liam there on the training side of things. You get, you won't believe. I know there's some of our guys who were, and they were guys on an offshore platform doing a construction job probably 10 years ago, they were getting about 500 or 600 grand a year, right? And they earned every cent. You're a long way from home, 12-hour shifts and all the rest of it. What happens in our industry, because the wage rates are so high, they pick people up out of other sectors and they drain them out of manufacturing and other sectors. Comalco, when they were at Bell Bay, Michael, a lot of the manufacturing companies there went to the wall because they were paying more and taking all their talent. So I think the big employers in this country need to step up and do the training themselves and train people not just for their own business, but for the Australian national prosperity point of view, because the points that Liam make are absolutely right. I can recall many, many years ago with the apprenticeships and the group training, and everybody was in and saw that it was in the national interest to do so. I think in recent years the ball's been dropped there, and those have had the economic power to do so have just gone and picked them out of other sectors, and that's made life really difficult for the other sectors. So yes, on a unity ticket with you, Liam.
Emma.
It's reducing working hours. So the 4-day week is the slogan. Whether that's 4 days or whether it's 32 hours over 5 or 6 or 7 days, I do think there aren't many things that you can call a silver bullet, but this is one that would have a lot of benefits. Where a 4-day week has been trialled around the world, the productivity benefits are clear. Massive reduction in sick leave, massive reduction in staff turnover. People are more productive when they're at work because they're focused on getting their work done in that shorter period of time. Useless things like long meetings and chatting in the kitchen are reduced because people are focused on getting that work done. It has to be for 100% of the productivity, for 100% of the wages, for 80% of the time. Ron mentioned at the very beginning of this evening that one of the things we're dealing with in the workforce these days are burnout and mental health issues. That's not just for workers, it's also for children. We're seeing huge rises in mental health concerns, particularly amongst teenagers. Families need more time. They are so stretched for time. And if that $200,000 worth of productivity that we didn't get over the last 20 years could be returned to us with a gradual move to a 35-hour week and then to a 32-hour week. A lot of businesses already do this. There are businesses that offer 35-hour weeks. It's an incredible incentive for staff. It means that you can, in white-collar jobs, particularly knowledge economy jobs, you can manage those hours across the workforce. And the big cry that it's not possible for customer-facing workers, for retail workers, for healthcare workers, for teachers. John Buchanan at UNSW has done some great work on this. It's called rostering people. It can be done. It does mean that more of the returns on those productivity gains are going to workers, and there will be a slightly higher cost for some employers in their wages bill, but the returns on productivity, on well-being, make it clear it's the way to go for the future.
All right, now just before we wrap up, Steve's got one more idea he wants to share with you.
Yeah, and where what Emma's outlined in terms of and where that works for the enterprise and the employees, knock yourself out. But we need to have a reality check here that Peter Reith was IR Minister in 1996. There was 120 Australian flagships. We have all the ships that go out to the vessel, out to the oil rigs and all the rest of it. We had bigger engineers, officers, ratings in our sector. How many Australian flagships do we have today? We've got about 12, right? So the productivity side of things, well, they're foreign flagships. So was it the money? No, it's that they do things when the vessel's at sea. They work 5 weeks on, 5 weeks off. There's a Norwegian roster. Sometimes they do 5 weeks off and have 10 weeks off. You can't, with these big bits of equipment, say, well, 4 days is up, we'll just fly out somewhere and take you home. You just got to be realistic. It's all good to be idealistic, but sometimes you need to be realistic. So where Emma has outlined things, where that can work, absolutely knock yourself out. But just realise that in reality world, different circumstances operate in different industries.
All right, thanks everyone. So I'll hand over to you, Ron.
Well, thank you very much, President Hatcher. It's been a very interesting debate where we've been looking at productivity and fairness. We began with Justice Bromberg explaining the origins of the Institute of Employment Rights and the Charter of Employment Rights and tripartitism. I've also been to the ILO and spent a lot of time in the United Nations, and I actually think that discussion, interests, tripartitism really works, and reasonable minds may differ on that. Steve, I have to let you remember how retirement ages in the High Court worked. Under the original Constitution, we followed the American system. They were life appointments. And in 1977, there was a constitutional amendment. I was under 30. I thought, good God, 70 seems too high. They're all fogies at that age. So, of course, I voted for it. Now that I'm closer to 80 than 70, I see how wrong I was. I'd go back to life appointments. I think we can split briefly notions of fairness and productivity separately, even though they work together. It's very clear from Steve, from Liam on my left, that we really, if we want to increase productivity, we have to increase machinery, capital equipment, even intellectual property equipment from artificial intelligence. We need to also work very hard on training. And I see that Associate Professor Anabach was the only one really to mention the importance of migration. And rather than having silly attacks on different groups of migrants, we really need to look more carefully at skills and utilise those skills to increase productivity. In relation to fairness, there were a broad spectrum of views. Liam O'Brien sees collective bargaining as central, and we've seen collective bargaining increase, and that's great. But most employees in this country aren't covered by collective agreements, so we've actually got to think of other ways. Professor Coyle spoke about measuring safety climates, looking at fairness in work. I disagree slightly. I think that there's a place for global surveys as well as for individual surveys. If we only had individual surveys, we wouldn't get a global sense. I'm sure he agrees with that anyway. We saw from Ms. Chow, Zena Chow and Emma Dawson that perhaps profits were not being shared equally, and fairness would require more profit sharing and the 4-day week. I think that working hours are becoming less fixed as we move into a digital cyberspace where people are working from home. The notion of the workplace has long gone. We have to think about fairness more broadly, and I come back to talking of wellness indexes or indices. We really need people to listen to one another. We really need people to be more inclusive of migrants, of persons with disabilities. We can all, if we all participate together, we can increase productivity and fairness in this country. Fairness begins not in the Fair Work Commission, where it has an important role. Fairness begins in our lives, in our families, in our workplaces, in our nation. And that's what we should look at. I really enjoyed the debate, and can I thank President Hatcher for getting the sparks flying. It's been a great evening. Thank you so much.
All right, look, we're slightly over time, so a quick wrap up. First of all, you've, as we say every year, heard many differing views tonight, some of which you will have agreed, many of which you will have disagreed, but all of which warrant your respect, for they all serve to inform just as to what may be the optimal system of workplace relations for this country. In that context, could I thank our wonderful panel for all of their interesting views? Could I thank Justice Hatcher for his brilliant moderation, the Minister for flying in and then scooting out after a very interesting address, Justice Bromberg for enlightening us with his perspective, and finally Ron for your brilliant leadership and mentorship for all of us over the years. Thank you for allowing us to name this debate for so many years in your honour. As you constantly point out, even though you are not quite dead yet. He allows us to make that joke every year, so thank you, Ron. And finally, could I thank all of you for attending and giving us your time, and all of those online. Could you just join me in giving a final thanks to all our panellists? Thanks very much.